So thank you for hanging in with us and joining us for the concluding session of what has been, I think, a very impressive meeting this week over the past several days. During our time today, we hope to engage in a thoughtful dialogue about the topic, how do we build evidence for success with Focus Ultrasound? I am joined by a panel of executives from companies who have successfully navigated the process of building the evidence needed to achieve commercial success. I'm Randy Williams, and I serve as a senior project manager at KI Research, just about a block from our hotel today. And I've worked closely with the Focus Ultrasound Foundation, Philips, and Insightech since 2012 on various research and education initiatives. And during my time, I have learned throughout this work that there are essentially 4 areas that you must achieve to be successful, and they all happen to start with the letter A: approvals, acceptance, awareness, and adoption. So I'm looking forward to engaging in a discussion with our panelists about those areas and how they have individually worked in their respective companies to obtain approval and also to be successful in the reimbursement endeavors. So we'll launch right into that discussion with their perspectives as well as their lessons learned. I'd like for each of our panelists to introduce themselves, their role in their respective companies, and also to speak to the technology and indications in which they've obtained approvals, both here in the United States with FDA approvals as well as globally, and also the status of reimbursement. So I'll start with you, Mark.
Thank you. Mark Carroll. I'm a neurosurgeon by training. I'm CEO of Sonicare Medical. We have 2 technologies, one for prostate cancer, one for laparoscopic ablation. The latter was cleared by a 510K back in 2008, and prostate cancer was cleared by a de novo grant approximately 6 months ago after an unsuccessful attempt to get a PMA for a cancer indication.
Maurice Ferre, CEO of Insightech. Insightech has been in this industry for 19 years. We have multiple products worldwide. We have about 120 systems installed globally. We break down our businesses into 3 sectors. We have the women's health, where we're focused on uterine fibroids. We have the oncology side of our business. We're doing a lot of work around bone meds, and our neuro and our systems have different types of regulatory approvals around the world. Just recently, we've got our FDA approval for essential tremors here in the United States, and we continue to do numerous research. We have over 40 protocols worldwide, globally, and we've done 14,000 procedures.
I am Emmanuel Blanc. I am the Chief Technical Officer of EDAP Technomed. This is a French-based company which is specialized in therapeutic ultrasound. We have 2 product ranges, one dedicated to lithotripsy and the other one dedicated to therapeutic ultrasound. A lithotripsy product get approval since many years through 510K. And we got approval for Ablatherm. We got CE mark in 2000, and just recently FDA approval in 2015 for Ablatherm HIFU device. We have treated many patients. We performed many clinical studies to get this approval, and we are looking now for the reimbursement. We already got in France, but we are still looking for reimbursement in US.
Yeah, Thomas Andres, my name. I'm the marketing director for MR Therapy with Philips Healthcare. And in the Focus Ultrasound range, we have the SonarLeave MR HIFU system, which is approved for uterine fibroids and bone metastasis in Europe and other jurisdictions in Asia. Unfortunately not in the United States, but though in Canada. And to get these approvals, we had to do some clinical research, and we do have a number of systems here installed in North America for clinical and preclinical research.
Great, thank you. And so the first question that I'd like to start with is, how do you establish evidence to satisfy the following stakeholders: regulators, clinicians, and patients? So Mark, maybe I can start with you, if you could address each of those key stakeholders and how you establish
Sure.
the evidence.
I think the patient side is unique, especially the way that Sonicare approached this many years ago, which was establishing a concierge medical network where patients from the U.S. were taken outside the U.S. for treatment in the Bahamas, in Bermuda, and in Mexico. This was based upon the work that had been done outside the United States, in Europe, and in Asia, demonstrating the validity of the technology. From a regulator point of view, when we submitted for PMA, you sit down with the FDA and you establish with the FDA what the criteria are going to be for the data that you're going to submit and for the criteria that are going to be used to assess that data. If you're following a 510K path, then it's somewhat different, because some instances you need clinical data and some instances you don't. A de novo falls into a unique area where it's sort of a 510K, but it's sort of a PMA, and that you have to satisfy the same clinical conditions. I think that finally, from a clinician point of view, again, the way that the concierge medical care worked with Sonicare was that not only did the patients go outside the United States to receive their care, but the physicians went outside the United States to learn how to deliver that care, anticipating a date in the future when the technology would be available in the United States. So during that time period prior to FDA grant, there were approximately 400 U.S. urologists who had experience outside the United States using this technology, thereby creating a ready opportunity once the technology was cleared, either to acquire the technology or to make that technology available to patients.
I mean, what I would, to Mark's comments, I totally agree with what he said, and so for the sake of not repeating it,
Yeah.
what I would add just to this part of the conversation is you can go all the way down these steps, and clearly first you have to think of the regulatory, obviously, and you know, they're gonna, the FDA or the regulatory bodies are gonna pretty much mandate these studies, and especially in what we do, which is primarily on these PMAs, and also on the de novo. More and more we're seeing the FDA asking for studies. So really, you know, through these IDEs or these PMAs, the FDA is going to mandate the studies. They're going to mandate, you know, the number of sites that you can have up and running, and they're going to be relatively conservative on their endpoints. They're going to want to see long-term data, or at least something. In our case, we're seeing where we have to see these follow-ups, at least the preliminary endpoints, at least being a year out. So that's a given. And they've also made it very difficult in that, especially in our brain applications, where it's not like radiosurgery where you can say, I can do this part of the brain. They're looking at the specific indication. So if you're going to target the GPI, for example, they're gonna want specific data and a specific cohort to go with that. Once you kind of get through that phase, I think that data, and I think it was representative with what we saw happen with a fantastic study that was done with the PI, with the Dr. Elias that we heard in this symposium, and with remarkable data, and the fact that it was such a great study, to me, was you have a p-value of 0.001, I think is pretty significant. And the fact that there wasn't a panel to review, unlike what we saw happen in the prostate side of it from the FDA's perspective. So that work and being upfront and designing a good study from a regulatory perspective is going to lead to the opportunity to put a significant study and get into a prestigious journal like the New England Journal of Medicine. So that, I think, is going to translate onto the clinical side of the experience. I think the challenge really becomes, unfortunately, from the insurance carriers. And when you're dealing with patients that are especially non-Medicare type patients, and this is what we're experiencing, is that they're always raising the bar. They're always making it more and more difficult to approve anything. It's not in their interest. And we're seeing this with our uterine fibroids, for example, where we have over 100 different studies that are done, but it's not good enough. It has to be, the bar is being raised and raised and raised. And this is where the outcry is. And it's just, if we were there earlier and pushing this along, I think we'd be much further along with reimbursements in this front. But we have to really fight hard for this. And that, I think, is where the battle lines are placed with the insurance companies. And I would suggest, and the way that we're looking at this, similar to Mark, and I think what Sonicare has done in particular, of going out there and creating a voice out there. I think the patients have to have a stronger voice of demanding these types of procedures, these types of surgeries, and they're forcing insurance companies to make these types of decisions. Because that is where we have to be. We have to follow through and try to do these studies that the insurance companies want. And even though they'll change the game as we get closer and closer to these endpoints and call foul, but we have to have patients out there that are filling out claims, that are making noise and saying that this is unfair, that we're not getting this type of treatment.
Thank you, Maurice, and I think that's a really critical point and piece, because despite the specifications that the FDA requires in those initial studies, it does seem that the reimbursement companies are somewhat elusive in what they want and what they're requiring, and they're obviously that ultimate stakeholder that we need to truly have the adoption. I don't know if Emmanuel or Thomas, you want to speak to what your experiences have been in terms of trying to anticipate what the reimbursement companies and the payers are looking for, and how you've been able to either successfully navigate that or perhaps some lessons learned from their changing sort of needs and requests.
Yes, I really think that the clinical trials is a key issue, and we have to perform the best clinical trials as we can. And the best one is comparative studies. And for the prostate cancer application, comparative studies are not possible. Nobody succeeds in comparing HIFU to surgery, HIFU to cryo, HIFU to radiation to surgery, for instance. So it means that this comparative study is being very difficult to perform. We have to move on single-arm studies, and the quality of the studies must be very high to get the proof that the system works. And it means that we have to collect a lot of data regarding the treatment procedure, regarding the clinical efficacy, regarding the adverse event, regarding the economics, and all these data must be collected and provided then to the authorities to try to get approval on the system. There is maybe a specific requirement for the providers. They look also for outpatient procedure, which is something very interesting because it's a good way to get low-cost treatment. And fortunately, HIFU technology allows this outpatient procedure, and I guess this is one of the main advantage of ultrasound, of therapeutic ultrasound, and it will help to get approval for this technique and further on to get reimbursement.
Yeah, to what Maurice was saying with the bar is raising from the insurance companies, we see that also from the regulatory bodies that the bar is raising. So focused ultrasound is or has been a relatively new technique, and since the first approval of a focused ultrasound device here by the FDA in North America or in the United States, they have learned a lot and raised the bar, and so is the bar rising in other jurisdictions, so that also there they demand clinical trials, preferably from their own population. So as a device manufacturer, you're confronted with, you got to do a clinical trial in the United States to cover all the African American, Caucasian, and Asian American population, and then in China they want a trial to for their own Chinese population, and in Europe, you also need clinical data. So that makes it increasingly difficult to satisfy all the regulatory bodies to start with before you're actually allowed to play in the field and come to the table and discuss with the insurance companies. And then they require comparative clinical data for procedures where it's really hard to imagine how a patient would consent to a procedure where she gets her belly cut up and has to recover for a couple of weeks versus an outpatient procedure. So having said that, this is for us also a kind of an opportunity with all these requirements rising to design trials that a priori try to satisfy the stakeholders until including the insurance companies, reimbursement authorities, and the structure is very different in different countries. But as Emmanuel said, comparative clinical data, that's the gold standard. Level 1 evidence, that's basically what everybody's looking for. And in Germany, they also require that one, and there is a process out there. We are in the middle of it, together with Insight driving that process to get reimbursement for uterine fibroid treatment with focused ultrasound. Designing a study, getting approval for a study that will then be funded for a comparative study to say, that would then be funded to a large extent by the German government, that would eventually evaluate this technology on a very high evidence level. And once this evidence is there, and the reimbursement is there, then the adoption, the chance that the adoption kicks in is much higher.
The one saving grace in the United States may be case-based management. So if we get to the point where we have case rates for prostate cancer, let's say, or for kidney cancer, or for uterine fibroids, and the device is cleared or approved or granted by the FDA, then you don't need a specific code. You don't need specific reimbursement. Whatever you get paid for surgery, you're going to get paid for HIFU. How long it will take for that to happen in the U.S. is unclear, but that's something that we can all hold out there as a holy grail, sort of.
So when you cannot achieve the randomized clinical trial, which as we know is the gold standard, or if you cannot achieve a comparative design, what has been your experience in the type of studies that seem to work well in satisfying the needs of the stakeholders we've been discussing this morning?
That's a very tough discussion to have with these people. And as Maurice said, in principle, they don't want to pay because it's a very appealing technology treatment for patients. So getting surgery, you have a mental barrier and decide, well, would I rather live with the pain, suffer through the pain for a little bit longer, as when there is a non-invasive procedure out there where you think, okay, I go into day surgery, let's get over with it, and somebody else pays, then they are concerned for a huge increase of patient volumes and money they have to carve out. And I think there is a business point from the insurance side that they try to keep a lid on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a rigged system. It really is. I mean, that's the and we
that's
just
a
have.
poisoned word these days.
I mean, we have to fight it. We have to fight it, and that's why I think what the foundation is doing in terms of being as an advocate, helping to create, awareness. I think, and education is the beginning of the battle, and then we have the advocacy, and we have to fight in Washington to push this through with CMS. I mean, that's the key, is that we have to keep on making noise here. And the good news is that I would say just the amount of awareness that's out there versus a year ago. I mean, we're making traction. So I think the key thing is, from everybody here in this audience and what we've heard, from all the way down from the beginning of the research, if the research keeps on showing promise and we keep on being on the cutting edge of the research and demonstrating that we can do these things first in animals and that there's hope. And then all of a sudden we start going into the clinical world, and we're starting to see multiple applications and multiple uses of this, and I think that's going to continue. And then as we've already, the foundation's already identified 60 applications for this stuff, so all of a sudden we have some momentum. And I think from our standpoint, being at the apex on the neuro applications, which is getting high visibility, we at Insight are very committed to making a lot of noise here and getting a lot of awareness and getting patients to really start advocating. And I think that over the next few years, the insurance companies are going to have to listen to this. One of the things that we're doing, for example, is that no matter what patient is going through the system, even if it's a patient that's paying out of pocket, we're insisting that they push the insurance companies to put claims. Because one of the biggest challenges is that there's no claim. So the insurance companies say, well, this isn't really that important because we only have very few claims. So it's a vicious cycle of procrastination and not getting this technology through. So we just have to keep on fighting this. But I'm encouraged.
I think the one thing, especially clinicians or people in the community that are looking to get this technology need to understand is what we're talking about is extremely expensive. Doing any kind of clinical trial nowadays costs a lot of money. And so if you're a small company and you're trying to be innovative and you're trying to push the envelope, and at the same time you have customers that are looking to get the equipment for free or to get a grant to do a trial, et cetera, it becomes very difficult to be able to stay in business. I think having a society like the Focused Ultrasound, which through their breadth and reach of individuals and contacts is able to provide funding for some of the kinds of clinical work, preclinical work, post-regulatory work that's necessary is very valuable. But we as manufacturers, especially smaller manufacturers, are especially squeezed.
In France, we work very closely with the French Association of Urologists and the Patient Association to get reimbursement. And at the end we succeed, but it takes 6 years finally. And the amount of reimbursement we have right now is equivalent to surgery, which is quite good, but surgery in France is reimbursed something like 6,000 euros. So there is nothing to compare with the reimbursement level in US or outside of when you are in Europe.
And that was going to be one of my next questions in terms of how do you get hospitals and clinicians to participate in a research and to adopt a technology without a clear reimbursement pathway?
I mean, to start with, these trials, clinical research, trials for product approvals or post-market follow-up trials, the large academic hospitals, they simply demand reimbursement from the manufacturer. So we have to pay for per patient, per procedure, but that is to generate the baseline clinical data, but that's not something sustainable to get really the momentum going. There we need foundations to support out-of-pocket payments, lobbying from patient organization, doing really the hard work that has been discussed in the previous session, one by one, making the claims. That's the way to go. Haven't found the silver bullet yet.
We've taken a new approach. We're making the Mexicans pay for it. I'm joking.
I think we've been forced as a very small company. We've been around for 15 years, but we're a startup. We only started selling equipment basically in the United States a year ago. We upfront state to partners, we don't have money to pay for these kinds of things. And if some academic institutions, for instance, don't allow cash pay. We can't play with them. There are academic institutions that need a creative way of dealing with that. So is there some other way to bring in an alternative therapy like radiation therapy into the mix where there is reimbursement and you can couple focused ultrasound with that? that's a possible approach. Working with the private practitioners or smaller hospitals that aren't bound by some of the covenants that maybe some of the academic institutions are, and have the ability to charge patients for treatments that have clinical validation, of course, is another path to take to getting the information out there. And frankly, I think in the US we've seen a much greater acceptance of non-US data. Both the EDAP submission as well as our submissions use European and Asian data now to support our submissions. And that's made a tremendous step forward. For instance, in our case, being able to use UK data where the British government is funding and paying for patient treatments, taking that data in-house has made life a lot easier for us.
So I'd like to open the floor for additional questions. Okay, come on up.
Thank the panel for the discussion. So my question is, the reimbursement is a big issue, and the current system policy is not designed friendly for the novel technology coming up. So my question is, the current system doesn't work. What do you think should be appropriate reimbursement policy or equation if you can get a person at the policy level to listen? What should we propose, for especially a novel technology? It doesn't really have the precedence in the clinic that you can use to do the calculation, right? So that's kind of first question. I have follow-up later, but I will have.
So I can give my 2 cents right now. There's actually a bill on the floor, which has been working with AVIMED, has been kind of pushing this agenda, and the idea is a very simple one, and it's basically where CMS and the FDA work together on innovative technology, which we would fit under that category. And what they basically say is, when the FDA approval occurs, that there's a reimbursement that's reasonable to allow this technology to succeed, and that after a 2-year period. So it's a review process. TRICARE is doing this from the government's perspective. So there's a precedence already set up for this. And I think if a bill like that can pass and we could adopt it and make sure that we have language in there that represents us, which we're working on, I think that helps to alleviate that as a hurdle. And it gives an out to the government, because they're giving it a period of time to see if this will adopt and then be evaluated. So I think that has some merit. I mean, the details have to be worked out, but I think that type of combined program to accelerate would be something from a policy perspective that has some value.
To complement to that one, I think a very important point during this trial period, if you want to say so, would be to collect the clinical data in a scientific appropriate way, that these can then be really well evaluated, and that you get really, and also then the acceptance from the community that you have the valid clinical data after this 2-year period.
Okay, keep in mind that the first step in reimbursement is getting a code. AMA issues the codes. AMA has its own criteria for what is acceptable for issuing a code. So you got the FDA, which has established extremely strict criteria for getting regulatory authorization, and then that work that you did is thrown out the door when you then have to go to AMA and get a code. That doesn't make any sense. In fact, in talking with Charles Viviano yesterday, he said the same thing. It makes no sense to him that there's 2 separate criteria. If the FDA has a set of criteria and you've met that criteria, why isn't that sufficient to have a code established?
And is there a way to sort of anticipate that separate criteria as you're planning during that regulatory process, or?
Well, right now it's difficult because there are different criteria depending upon the category of approval that you
Right.
have, whether you need a controlled trial with level 1 evidence or not with level 2. The data that you present to the FDA then has to be published in ways that you can't do before you get to the FDA, which just introduces a much longer time period, even if you were able to determine it ahead of time, as opposed to if there was an agreement up front, as was suggested. You get FDA authorization, that data has already been determined to be acceptable by AMA to issue codes. It gets you much further along the path, saves you 3 years.
Yeah, that's a very important point, and we have been at this junction for uterine fibroids, where then the societies, the medical specialty societies who need to endorse such a code change, or the AMA say, well, where's utilization? We don't see utilization, so why would we care? So then the point is, how do you get utilization without reimbursement for significant capital equipment? So
we'll let one last question.
Yeah, my follow-up question, or if nobody else is asking, is that, so there's also the high cost of this rather sophisticated procedure, especially if you use MRI as guidance. So how much of it, I'm trying to think, even you trying to fight and get in reimbursement, but there's always a high cost, insurance company always going to fight back. So trying to understand the impact of the high cost and how that prevents the widespread use of this new technology, and what is really what the research on our side should be done to trying to reduce the cost and trying to get some sense from the industry leaders.
I think you have to be careful how you define high cost. Is it the high upfront cost of the capital equipment, or is it high cost relative to patient care over an extended period of time? The big problem is that the insurance companies don't care about the latter. They only care about the upfront payment, because by the time the patient has a complication, they're under control of some other insurance company. I think that's a major issue. But I think the cost needs to be looked at in a proper light in order to compare it to existing technologies.
So I still think the system is rigged, and I think that part of the challenge is to bring the right conversation to the payers. And the way that the system is structured, when you look at, for example, CMS, and you look at how they look at APC codes and how they do all their analysis based on claims. It's claims data, okay? Now, that makes no sense, because all they're looking at is charges, right? They're looking at the charges and say, okay, we will assign a value of what the reimbursement is based on how you, the hospital, are charging me. Why aren't they looking at economic data? Why aren't they looking at defining an endpoint, or whatever it is as an endpoint, and measuring what the cost of treating that patient is over that period of time, and give a reimbursement or a comparative of, there's all different types of treatments. Like, for example, in prostate, if you look at the treatment of a radical prostatectomy versus a focal lesion, how can you, or hemiablation, like these two guys are doing here. I mean, there's data out there, and we have to push the economic agenda. So I think we, an industry, have to work closely in health economics and start bringing up these arguments about costs.
Well, I appreciate the panelists' time. Mark, Maurice, Emmanuel, and Thomas, thank you for your insights. I think that this conversation is one that we could probably talk for a few hours. But I think that the comments provided by our panelists today have given us some food for thought in terms of the type of evidence that's needed, that's often different and often demanding across all of the key stakeholders in order to achieve the success of using focus ultrasound. So I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.
It'd be great to get you guys involved.